Hi, thanks for joining. Before we get started, please make sure that you have subscribed to follow us on all the various feeds here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube, the written stuff on Substack, as well as the quick takes and posts on Instagram and on Threads. Make sure you're giving us that 5-star rating. Make sure you're giving us that big thumbs up, sharing out what we're publishing with all of your friends and family. We're going to once again discuss a little bit about body image issues and some of the dysmorphic issues that can come about as relates to the cultural pressures that we have to look a certain way. For those of you that have any issues with these topics, with these ideas, I've placed into the description links to various organizations that can assist you with any type of health or mental health issues that can arise from the ideas and concepts that we're about to discuss. There are certain norms, certain ideals that get passed within cultures, within societies that indicate whether or not we have attractiveness, whether or not we have a quality to us that would lead to appreciation, that would lead to wanting to model behavior, that would want to have some sort of reproductive attractiveness is one of the ways that we might think about this in terms of, do we find that person physically appealing? And this ideal changes within societies, changes within time, that leads to constant fluctuation in terms of what society deems as being beautiful, what society deems as being attractive, that can and does lead to a host of health issues, that can and does lead to a host of medical problems, that can and does lead to a host of psychological problems. One of the ways that we have expanded on this ideal currently within our current society is the idea that fat is unattractive, that fat is something to be avoided in terms of body fat. But how does that messaging, how does that ideal lead to issues that we hope to resolve by eliminating body fat? How does that cause health issues to come about? Is the ideals of thinness, is the culture of thinness ruining our health? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
When we start looking at how the culture and our society approaches body image and the way in which we present ourselves, there is a sense that we have a culture of thinness, a idea where we praise the thin and kind of ridicule the thick. And there's a host of issues that can come about from this idea, even though we state that we're more aware of the fact that body image is not the ideals of health, that are not the ideals of beauty, where we have a rising awareness and a rising popularity around things such as the body positivity stuff that we've talked about previously, where we're still beholden to a cultural ideal about what thin means and about what thick means. A culture that is quite possibly ruining our health. It's quite possibly ruining our health because of the fact that we rely upon actions and recommendations from individuals that see thin as the end of our health journey and thick as being what we want to avoid. Actions that are often done by a combination of smugness by the recommender, smugness where they're seeing themselves as being right, as having this ideal of I'm right, you're wrong, this self-righteousness of being on a mission to combat the health ills of overfat, of obesity. This self-righteousness that's sometimes cloaked in a religious fervor by the presenter that they are simply wanting people to be healthy. This combination of praise and persecution comes about through a never-ending barrage of implicit and explicit overt messaging messaging that makes many feel that they are unfit, unhealthy, or obese, even if the reality of their lives is quite the opposite. This is where we pointed out over almost 14, 15 years ago that we live in a continuum of healthiness based off of our fitness and our fatness factors. And we utilize the term fitness and fatness not to ridicule fat, but to indicate that when we start to accumulate fat mass, adverse health comes with it, where there is excessive amounts of inflammation that come about, that there's chronic inflammation that can come about that lead to a host of the non-communicable diseases that we spend billions of dollars on each year treating. But what's happened is that message that we have this continuum, this fitness and fatness continuum, has been stoked by this overt and this implicit messaging that unless you are very low body fat, that unless you look like Adonis, that unless you have the zero body fat for the men, that you look like the bodybuilders, or that you have this minimal amount of fat and look like the supermodels for the women, you're unfit, that you're unattractive, that you're unhealthy. And that ideal that has corrupted the messaging that we first put out there back in 2009, 2010, that corrupting has always been there. It's underlied a lot of the advertisements about health. That is the implication for this desire that has been around for centuries now, that somehow we can get a pill, a magic pill, that is somehow going to eliminate the body fat issues as it relates to health. But what's happened is that corruption of fat associated with health issues to fat being unattractive, unwanted, has permeated throughout society in this cultural ideal of thinness. And it's a cultural ideal of thinness that we want to think about as being a secular thing, a societal thing that has underpinnings to it based off of the self-righteousness, the smugness of the people pushing this thin ideal into this ideal of, or based off of, this kind of religious fervor about wanting people to be more active doing the exercise that I want them to do, to eating healthier, but eating the way that I want them to eat. This ideal that takes on the characteristics of religion within the cultural practices of this culture of thinness. A culture that gets expressed through multiple types of icons and images that get portrayed, where self-worth comes from looking a certain way, where I'm going to do whatever I can do in order to improve my sense of self-worth by changing whatever behaviors I can change, by doing whatever I can do in order to obtain that ideal image of what society has deemed to be worthy. Even if what's being projected to us is augmented from what reality actually is for the person being projected, whether it is now with the AI imaging that we see within media feeds, or if it's simply just the photoshopping that takes place with images, or if it's simply just how the person being photographed or being videoed, how lighting within that environment is done, to the use of pharmaceutical agents, to the use of cosmetic surgery, augmentations in such a way that it's sometimes very difficult to figure out what is real and what is artificial, what is augmented reality when it comes to what is being portrayed as the socially deemed or culturally deemed appropriate body image for the individual. When we can't differentiate between fake and real, it becomes very hard to understand what is the appropriate behaviors to undertake in order to be healthy. And this is where we get lost in the discussion as to what is healthy versus what is body image. And that inability to differentiate between the two leads to hosts of issues. The augmentation that we see in these displays in media, we readily acknowledge that we get a false sense of ideals by looking at these augmented icons, by looking at these augmented images. They give us a false sense of what to focus on within diet and within exercise, where we lack awareness as to the normal curve for the population and the fact that everybody's going to fall somewhere on that normal curve, that everybody's going to have different genetic components, different hormonal components, different environmental cues, different social cues, different psychological cues as to what they're willing to do and what they're willing not to do in terms of behaviors. The ideal about that self-motivated, self-selected, self-monitored behavior, allowing for long-term follow-through on diet and exercise. But at the same time, the images and the icons that stimulate our actions and our responses, both internally and externally, towards ourselves and towards others, is going to determine how we respond and what we do based off of whether or not we fit into the image of what is socially accepted as appropriate body image, what is thin. The culturally inspired and culturally accepted actions, the culturally inspired and culturally accepted responses that we have for both diets as well as exercise that is necessary for us to achieve the weight loss that we think we have to achieve in order to obtain the conditionally accepted ideal for beauty. And it's the conditionally accepted ideal for beauty that we mistake as the conditionally accepted ideal for health. The conditionally accepted ideal for health is how is my body functioning as relates to the optimal conditions that my body can function at. And this is where we go back to that continuum of fitness versus fatness, where the more sedentary behaviors I have, the less active I am. The higher on the fatness scale I put myself, and the lower on the fitness scale I put myself on in terms of that continuum between fitness and fatness. The fewer pro-health behaviors I follow, the more alcohol I consume, the more cigarettes I smoke, the more e-cigarettes I use, the more processed foods I consume, the more exposure I get to endocrine disruptors and metabolic disruptors. The more chronic inflammation I build within my body, the more fatness I will express, and the less fitness I will express. Versus the more active I am, the more pro-health behaviors I follow, the more fiber I eat in my diet, the less processed foods that I consume. The further I'm going to push myself towards the fitness end of that continuum scale, that's going to diminish the amount of chronic inflammation that I have. That's going to make me healthier. The problem is that the focus that we have on tying diet and exercise to the values of the society, in particular the aesthetics of the person, forms the basis for cultural identities and forms the basis for inclusion and exclusion of members, all members of the society. if we take that ideal and we look at, okay, how do we project that aesthetic motivator? How do we project the body image ideal, the cultural identities of thinness that get pushed on us with a religious fervor, that we want to be thin, we don't want to be thick? If we simply just look at the messages that gets projected to us, the commercials about weight loss products, the magazine articles, the social media feeds that we get, all touting the latest and greatest medical breakthrough in terms of weight loss, in terms of diet, in terms of exercise. The pitches that we get to join a specific diet club, the pitches that we get to join a fitness center, the medical spiels that doctors will give people that they see as not fitting into the cultural ideal of thin, the watch what you eat, the exercise more, the idea that you have to do those things from the medical perspective before it will treat any malady that you might present, any diseases that you might present. This weight bias that medical professionals have towards people who don't fit into the ideal of thin continue to propagate the culture of thinness, even if the intention is not there. Even if the idea that they are presenting some sort of bias within their treatment of the individual is not recognized. This ideal about needing to be thin in order to be healthy gets propagated throughout society. The idea that there is worthiness and worthiness alone through thinness is what is the underlying idea about this culture of thinness. That my self-worth is tied up with, am I thin enough to be accepted? Ideas that we can see with every observation that we make about our culture. Our culture has embedded within it this idea of worthiness of being thin, a quality that you must undertake some quest for thinness in order to fit into the culture. Ideals that come from the advertisements that we see about how we need to, quote, lose inches, that we can somehow take a pill or a drug that will, quote, melt the fat away. That we have people who propagate unscientific ideals that you can specifically lose weight in specific areas of the body. That we see our social media feeds inundated with the anecdotes, with the tales of individuals about this is how I was able to quickly lose the unwanted weight. And you can do the exact same thing too if you're willing to do what I did. The observations that we see in the news, where we have the horror stories of the medical professionals that fail to treat serious medical conditions simply due to the false belief that the symptoms that are being presented were caused by and due to the person's weight issues, where resolution of the weight issue will automatically resolve the medical condition. The earlier drives, the drives from the worthiness that get projected to us by the media, employ compulsive behaviors to achieve thinness, potentially at the cost of overall health. While the later drives, the medical ignorance, the idea that the medical professional will ignore the maladies of the person that happens to have excessive weight. Those cultural, those societal drives, those drivers will lead many who express a culturally unaccepted body image to avoid medical attention out of fear of not being listened to, or out of a fear of being shamed for not expressing the culturally accepted body image ideal. At the same time, the earlier ideas, the social media ideas, the anecdotes ideas, act as drivers for many people who don't express the culturally accepted ideals of thin, to see fitness centers as places to avoid, to see distinct behaviors as behaviors to avoid. avoidance behaviors that lead to increased sedentary behaviors that lead to more anti-health, or just more appropriately, less pro-health behavioral use. We start using less pro-health behaviors because of avoidance patterns, because we are not socially accepted based solely on our body image. There are aspects of our culture that have led to multiple discussions and a host of discourse among health professionals and among researchers, particularly researchers that look at weight control, that suggests that there is something more being negotiated in the pursuit, in the quest for thinness, that leads to subcultural movements within the culture of thinness that makes thinness a religious obligation more than simply a cultural underpinning. An idea where actions of pursuit of thinness become a signifier, become the signification of purity for the person. The thinner the person is, the more the person is willing to sacrifice in order to be seen as fit, in order to be seen as ideal. The purer that individual becomes, the more saintly that individual becomes within that religious obligation towards the cultural underpinnings of thinness. This is where we start having our cults developing within our culture. It's ideals about this pursuit of thinness that for the longest time have only been attributed to females. And that's simply because of the way in which we had medical diagnostic techniques in order to look at the psychological and cognitive drivers towards behaviors that can lead to health issues from this pursuit for thinness. Recently, we have seen the impact that this culture and the cults associated within the culture have on males, have on men within society, where we have actions and ideals that blur the line in between our secular view of culture and our religious view of culture. Regardless of how we look at this ideal of thinness, whether we're looking at it from a secular cultural view or a religious cultural view, the undertaking actions and the recommendations being offered fail to underscore what it means to be healthy by idolizing the creation of the slender body or the muscular body, what people reference as the quote-unquote toned body, in which creating the body image, the quote-unquote toned body image, is a matter of all-pervading significance. An end whose achievement seems tantamount to the punishments that must be experienced in order to achieve that toned body, where one justifies the sacrifices being made, the time spent exercising, the meals that are skipped, the parties that are skipped, the obligations to other parts of their life that are ignored, is for the greater glorification of the body image that we have come to idolize. It's this pattern of idolization of body image that have crept out of subculture and have become part of full culture, even with the acknowledgement of the movements towards body positivity, both in advertisements as well as in media portrayals of individuals, showing individuals across various body types, showing individuals across various cultural norms, has become commonplace. Yet, the infiltration of this idolization of the toned body and the glorification of the sacrifices being made in order to get that idolized toned body circumvents any of the positive health aspects that can come about from the encouragement of the inclusivity of various body types and various cultural norms within the portrayal of body image. Ideology that has crept its way into messaging, the way in which we think about what it means to be thin, what it means to be thick, crept its way into public health discussions about eating, about dieting, crept its way into marketing of mass-produced foods. Messaging that tiptoes the line between being confusing and being obsessive-compulsive. Messaging that can almost seem downright schizophrenic. Messaging that has on one side of a page restriction, whereas on the other side of the page, indulge. We look at magazines where we have on the left page, follow a water diet in order to achieve your health goals. While on the right side of the magazine, an article simply about food bliss and how we should enjoy the foods that we're eating. Messaging that leads to the consumption of ultra-processed foods with recognized metabolic disruptors and sweetened foods with recognized metabolic disruptors that can impact bliss point and reward responses that cause overconsumption of foods that have known metabolic disruptors that can trigger overfatness issues, that can trigger chronic inflammation issues, along with the use of a host of dietary supplements that are meant to stimulate weight loss and curb appetite that may not be as healthy as what the sellers want us to think. Messaging that misappropriates the importance of caloric content for foods over the nutritional content of what we're eating, where the estimated energy content blankets every food label that we see, yet the true nutritional information is haphazardly compiled and partially summarized, where we become more aware of numerical quantas within the food as opposed to the actual nutrients of the food. The takeaway messaging of this type of marketing is to understand nutrition based off of energy content and not about nutrition. Messaging that has us understand that nutrition is based on energy content of the food that should somehow be expended through exercise, even though the energy expended during exercise and after exercise is a fraction of the total energy expenditure simply necessary to live. Messaging that leads to a feeling that one must compulsively exercise to offset energy intake from foods without awareness of the nutrients required in order to maintain normal homeostasis, in order to maintain optimal performance, in order to maintain health, where we are more aware of the energy component to them than we are to the nutrients there, that we are somehow more attuned to the energy that we are supposedly expending in order to maintain normal metabolic functions, in order to maintain normal health, as opposed to the nutrients required in order to properly maintain the cells, the tissues, the organs of the body, while also allowing the cells, the tissues, and the organs of the body to grow and to repair. Where we blatantly label some foods and some nutrients as being intrinsically bad or unhealthy, while other foods and other nutrients as intrinsically healthy, where we have demonized carbohydrates, where we have demonized sugars, where we have exalted proteins and exalted amino acids, where we demonize specific types of exercise while exalting other forms of exercise, where we have a focus on diet and exercise based off of energy and energy expenditure versus nutrient load and nutrient balance that leads to a number of body dysmorphic eating behaviors, such as bulimia, anorexia, exercise bulimia. But more importantly, it can and does instill nutrient deficits, deficiencies in key nutrients, even when we feel like we're following the appropriate dietary practice based off of what the subculture that we have aligned ourselves with in terms of the culture that we hope to follow, and has us believe is the appropriate dietary practice. Deficits that can be detrimental, that can have detrimental effects on tissue health and play a major role in developing diseased statuses later on that contribute to diseases like osteopenia leading to osteoporosis, sarcopenia leading to loss of skeletal muscle, and even neurodegenerative diseases. At the same time, the focus of diet based on the rules of do's and do nots establishes the underlying control of dietary dogmas that build upon the culture of thinness to establish distinct subcultures of inclusion and exclusion based simply on the willingness to eat, or more importantly, not to eat, specific types of food. Dietary practices, just as with the excessive focus on caloric content and being under specific number regardless of what is being consumed, can lead to the nutrient deficits that, while a short term can cause improvements in health, might not be noted over time and will adversely impact overall health. A similar sense that is seen with the type of exercises that we're willing to do, or the pattern of exercise, or the programs we're willing to follow based off of social acceptance, based off of cultural acceptance, or the type of exercise that we are following, or the indoctrination to exercise programs that lead to inclusion and exclusion of individuals within society based off of the willingness to do specific types of exercise, where we get an overexposure to certain types of exercise programs and exercise patterns as being socially acceptable versus socially unacceptable. The misguided practices here lead to the multitude of fad diets and fad exercise programs that we hear about, have tried, intend to try, or hope to avoid. The cultural desire and the cultural ideals of thinness leads to many of the body-related messages that we see throughout publications, but also the psychosocial issues that develop within those messages, that develop early in adolescence and propagate to many of the behaviors that are hallmarks of the cultures, such as body image comparisons. Body image comparisons and body image related messages from peers, from parents, from respected elders become associated with increased compulsive exercise behaviors and increased dietary behaviors and attitudes in a hope to reach the idealized thinness necessary to be accepted. A pattern of comparison where young people begin to view their appearances and their abilities based on the appearance and abilities of their friends, of their peers, and of those who serve as role models for what they hope to be. Comparisons that lead to compulsive dietary behavioral changes, excessive exercise in the pursuit of aligning self-image with the external pressures being placed on them that take hold in boys and girls, in young men and young women, and carry on into adulthood. Comparisons that can be compromised by the verbiage and the messages conveyed by adults and by parents to the adolescents as they start to develop their sense of self, their sense of body image, and their sense of self-worth. These social comparisons and messages about self-worth based on body image mediate the relationship between body-related messages from peers and the drive for specific body types. For boys and for young men, this tends to be a drive for muscularity, whereas for girls and young women, is a desire to have limited amount of fatness. The psychosocial drivers lead to the compulsiveness of behaviors. For boys and for men, this tends to be compulsive amounts of resistance training and the propagation of the misconception about nutrition requirements, in particular protein requirements, the importance of specific dietary supplements, in particular the necessity for creatine and for specific amino acid supplementations, and can instill the intrinsic desire to utilize specific doping agents such as anabolic steroids and growth hormone in a necessity to achieve the cultural ideals for thinness in men being represented as muscular body tone. The ideals that are exaggerated by marketing messages of build muscle, lose fat, that inundate media posts, that come from the self-proclaimed fitness experts or from the person selling the fitness center to those enrolling as new members. The psychosocial drivers and desires portrayed towards girls and towards young women is not necessarily about consuming specific foods, but more about avoiding specific foods, about avoiding ultra-processed food, about avoiding sugar, about eating proteins, eating vegetables, minimizing what you consume in total, about using excessive amounts of endurance exercise, excessive amounts of aerobic exercise, a compulsion that is overly focused on energy expenditure and caloric imbalance as a means to meet the ideals of body image through socially acceptable exercise behaviors. The compulsive behaviors that are instilled during the adolescence lead not only to psychological issues, body dysmorphic issues, depression, anxiety around food and around exercise, but also physiological health issues that come about through the disruption of normal hormone feedback regulation. The physiological responsive to the compulsive behaviors that are undertaken in an attempt to fit into the culture of thinness adversely impact overall health through the disruption of normal hormonal regulation. The reliance on dietary supplements in order to, quote, burn fat or to increase energy expenditure during exercise has limited effectiveness relative to simply doing pro-health behaviors and has been linked with severe cardiovascular effects, including heart attack, including hypertension, and have even been attributed to numerous deaths. The excessive amounts of exercise without appropriate recovery lead to overtraining issues, lead to overtraining and inflammation and immune signals that can reverse many of the benefits that have been gained from exercise. Reverses that can trigger a sense that someone needs to work out even more and even harder in order to regain the benefits that are being lost, even though simply doing so will lead to greater expression of overtraining, where excessive restriction in diets are linked with hormonal imbalances and metabolic changes that limit overall body compositional changes, can lead to loss of fat-free mass, while conservation of fat mass in the long term due to hormonal changes can lead to disruption of reproductive functions, can lead to disruption of anabolic functions, growth functions in the person attempting to grow and attempting to mature. The ideals portrayed by the culture of thinness have an adverse effect on our overall health, while the activities while the recommendations being made by many projecting the culture of thinness have some benefit to them, the means by which they are portrayed, the means in which they are projected, lead to adverse effects on both the psyche of the individual as well as the physiology of the individual. Following balanced diets, following appropriate exercise regimens is necessary in order to establish pro-health behaviors, in order to project yourself onto the fitness side of the continuum of fitness and fatness. However, the idolization of the quote toned body, the idolization of the quote thin body leads to a host of health issues that can ruin overall health, can lead to psychological conditions for the person to the detriment of the person. We have spoken about a lot of these issues previously, and I would recommend going back and listening to or watching those videos and listening to those podcasts on periodization of exercise in order to allow for proper changes to take place within your physiology, to allow for weight loss, to allow for increase in strength, to allow for increases in optimal performance. Be aware of the fad diets that can lead to health issues. Be aware of the dogmatic diets that can lead to deficits in your nutrient loads. Remember that metabolism and diet is not about calories, it's about nutrition load. Remember that exercise is about providing stimulus to the body to trigger an overload response, to allow for growth, but to do so in a periodized fashion so as to not lead to the overtraining issues that can come about from excessive exercise. Excessive exercise and excessive dietary restrictions that become the hallmark of the idolization of the toned body, of the thin body, within the religious fervor of the culture of thinness is what leads to the ruination of overall health within this idealization, within this culture of thinness. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you got a little bit out of this. Hopefully this raised some curiosity questions for you. Please make sure you're dropping us questions and comments about any of the stuff that we're covering. If you wish us to cover specific things, please let us know. We're more than happy to listen to any of the comments that you happen to have and try to respond appropriately to those comments. Please make sure that you're giving us that big 5-star rating. Make sure you give us this big thumbs up, sharing out what we're putting out there with all your friends and family. Following us on all of the platforms, podcast, YouTube, as well as on Substack with the quick posts on Threads and on Instagram.